What was Lucifer's identity before the world came to know him as Satan? Once upon a time, he shone as heaven's most brilliant angel, a star of the morning, God's most magnificent creation, until a profound transformation took place. Throughout the pages of the Bible, fragments of his tale lie scattered, like pieces of a puzzle awaiting someone to put them together. In this exploration, we're assembling the complete narrative of Lucifer's descent, from his elevated station beside God down to his banishment as humanity's great opponent. Before we dive in, if these explorations help you find rest or moments of reflection, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Doing so helps other curious souls discover their way to this content. Also, share with us where you're tuning in from and what hour of the day it is. So, with no more delay, shall we begin? In the very beginning, before time could be counted, before the stars received their names, before death possessed any shadow it could throw, there existed only light. Not the variety that reflects off surfaces or causes the eyes to squint, but the original, the living light. Creation flowed forth from it. And within that creation, there existed structure, a hierarchy, a flawless equilibrium where each being possessed a purpose, a vibration, a blueprint. Standing at the summit of this divine framework was a single being, unmatched in magnificence, strength, and stature, Lucifer. He wasn't simply another angel. He was the angel, the consecrated cherub who sheltered the throne. Dazzling in his glow, awe-inspiring in his flawlessness, fashioned by God's own hands, Lucifer stood as a work of art, portrayed as brimming with understanding and unblemished in splendor. Precious stones of every kind decorated him. Sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald. Music flowed through his very essence. Timbrels and pipes were formed within him on the day he came into existence. He didn't simply perform with instruments. He embodied one. He didn't merely wear illumination, he exhaled it. If heaven possessed a prince, he held that title. If heaven boasted a star, his name claimed it. The morning star, the bearer of light. He carried not just radiance, but dominion. Certain theologians propose he governed Eden before humanity existed. Not the garden where Adam walked, but an earlier celestial Eden. He moved among the fiery stones, a dimension of unfathomable sanctity reserved for those nearest to the throne. Lucifer wasn't merely close to God. He belonged to God's innermost circle, a being who stood before eternity itself without flinching. Formed without imperfection, without defect, and yet he was not God. That crucial difference would eventually become the fracture that divided eternity. Perfection, by its very nature, cannot expand, cannot climb higher. Yet Lucifer, the most flawless of all created beings, carried within himself a contradiction, a yearning to ascend even further, not merely to serve, but to command, not merely to mirror glory, but to possess it. The very first uprising in all of existence wasn't sparked by brutality or malice or the need to survive. It emerged from beauty, a beauty so intense it couldn't perceive itself as anything less than godlike. Scripture reveals to us that pride was discovered in him, not implanted, not formed, discovered, hidden within the free will that even angels hold, a sacred enigma, the capacity to make choices, even in paradise. This wasn't an error in design. It was a trial no one realized was unfolding. Lucifer's descent didn't commence with a cry. It started in quietness, in calm, in the hushed, chilling awareness that he desired something greater. Everything was his, but the throne remained beyond his reach, and he craved the throne, not to be seated alongside God, but positioned above him. I will climb into heaven. I will lift my throne beyond the stars of God. I will take my place upon the mount of the congregation. I will rise above the peaks of the clouds. I will become like the Most High. 5 statements, 5 acts of treason, each one cutting through the fabric of devotion like a sword forged from light. This wasn't mere aspiration, this was insurrection. This was warfare conceived from within the uppermost levels of holiness. And yet, in the instant of Lucifer's formation, no trace of it existed. He was without fault in his conduct from the day he was fashioned until wrongdoing was uncovered in him. The word uncovered carries weight. It wasn't inserted. It wasn't painted on. It was found like a sleeping ember catching fire on its own. His magnificence twisted his understanding. That's the message the prophet Ezekiel conveyed. Not that his understanding corrupted his magnificence, but the reverse. The container became captivated by the container. The reflection forgot it was merely reflecting. Lucifer gazed upon his own splendor and confused it for source instead of resonance. And gradually, what had been appreciation transformed into presumption. The light-bringer started to resent the origin of light. He started to believe it was indebted to him. Picture a being constructed in the flames of holiness, growing frigid, not from deficiency, but from want. He started collecting murmurs, building coalitions, planting seeds of uncertainty, not through outright falsehoods yet, but through inquiries, delicate, shrewd, smooth as silk. He didn't charge heaven's barriers. He enlisted from the inside. But that portion belongs to another chapter. For this moment, grasp this. The being known as Lucifer represented the summit of divine artistry. His title, which carries the Latin meaning of light-bearer, wasn't spoken in mockery. It was precise. The Hebrew term employed is Hellel, signifying shining one. The Greeks in later times would name him Phosphoros, the morning star, Venus, the announcer of the sun. All designations that once conveyed honor, now shrouded in disgrace. In the book of Isaiah, a prophetic mockery directed at the king of Babylon wraps itself in cosmic language. How have you plummeted from heaven, O Lucifer, offspring of the morning? Numerous scholars contend Isaiah was speaking in metaphors about an earthly king, but others, the mystics, theologians, poets, perceived a deeper echo, a deeper plunge, one that rattled the very cornerstones of the heavens. And even if Isaiah referenced Babylon, the metaphor wouldn't be coincidental. Because every dictator, every usurper, every empire that consumed itself in its hunger for more was following a shadow, the original plunge, the initial betrayal. Long before Eden existed, long before Eve and Adam walked, the fall had already commenced. Not in earth's dirt, but in heaven's core. Lucifer was formed perfect, but perfection absent humility transforms into venom. He was beauty given form, power made sacred, wisdom elevated. But he craved adoration, not as a representative of the Creator, but as the Creator himself. That hunger, the foundation of all subsequent wickedness, was birthed not in hell, but in heaven, in the most exquisite place ever constructed, by the most exquisite being ever constructed. And there lies the heartbreaking paradox. Evil's initial breath didn't reek of sulfur. It carried the scent of roses. It sparkled. It resonated with song. It moved you to tears with its wonder. And then it rotated. It's simple to despise monsters, more difficult to despise angels who descend because they don't descend while screaming. They descend while gleaming. They descend while grinning. And sometimes they don't even perceive they're descending. Not until the opportunity has passed. Not until the light they bear becomes darkness. That's the point where the narrative commences. Not with horns or pitchforks, but with melody, luminosity, magnificence, a being of such breathtaking perfection that he even deceived himself. Lucifer was the masterwork, and the masterwork would transform into the catastrophe. To grasp Lucifer's downfall, we need to first understand the divine structure from which he plummeted. Heaven, as portrayed in biblical writings and texts beyond the Bible, is not a shapeless domain, but a carefully organized kingdom with clear orders and levels of authority. a flawless cosmic administration of divine beings carrying out the Creator's intentions. The angelic assembly is organized in exact rankings, frequently described as 9 choirs, separated into 3 spheres of authority. At the uppermost level exist the seraphim, 6-winged beings of absolute devotion who circle God's throne, perpetually singing, "Holy, holy, holy." These living fires of divine affection, whose very designation means burning ones, remain in constant praise, positioned nearest to the divine presence. Following them are the cherubim, protectors and carriers of God's glory, portrayed with 4 faces and innumerable eyes representing complete knowledge and watchfulness. The thrones, enigmatic wheel-shaped entities, complete this uppermost sphere, functioning as the manifestation of divine justice and power. The middle level of hierarchy comprises the dominions, who oversee the responsibilities of lesser angels, the virtues connected with wonders and cosmic motion, and the powers, warrior angels, who preserve cosmic balance and drive back demonic entities. In the lowest sphere, nearest to humanity's domain, are the principalities, supervisors of nations and large populations, the archangels, God's primary messengers, and the angels, the most plentiful heavenly beings who engage most often with humanity. Where did Lucifer fit in this divine organization? Scripture offers intriguing hints, but no absolute clarification. Ezekiel 28 portrays him as the anointed cherub who covers, implying a rank among the cherubim, those elevated guardians of God's holiness. Yet alternative traditions position him among the seraphim, the supreme order, or as the leader of the archangels. What appears uniform across these understandings is his remarkable status, not simply one angel among countless others, but a being of unique significance within the celestial ranks. Certain theologians propose Lucifer was formed as the absolute pinnacle of angelic existence, potentially even the most elevated created being in all of heaven. His designation itself, Lucifer, the light-bearer, implies a function of illumination and disclosure. He may have been the angel tasked with mirroring God's light to the remainder of creation, the morning star that announced divine glory across the cosmos. His responsibilities likely encompass the most sacred and vital of tasks. As a cherub, he may have been protector of God's holiness itself, permitted to approach the divine presence in manners few others could. If he stood among the archangels, his duty would have been governance, commanding enormous legions of angels in the arrangement of creation. Traditional understandings have occasionally assigned him authority over music and adoration, making him heaven's choirmaster, directing the unending symphonies of worship that echoed through the celestial realms. What makes Lucifer's rank all the more exceptional is that it appears he occupied not just a single function, but multiple spheres of authority. He was multidimensional in his radiance, adaptable in his capabilities, and entrusted with remarkable responsibility. Certain theological traditions propose he carried the very stamp of perfection, the living representation of created superiority, flawlessly accomplishing his divine purpose at creation's birth. The angels beneath his command would have been countless, potentially a third of the heavenly assembly, if we embrace the imagery from Revelation describing how many accompanied him in his ultimate rebellion. His sway extended across heaven's courts, his understanding respected, his magnificence admired, his decisions trusted. In the perfect system of merit in heaven, Lucifer had climbed to heights that perfectly corresponded with his unequaled gifts. It was exactly this elevated rank that made what came next so heartbreaking. For in a domain of flawless order and unity, where each angelic being accomplished their purpose with delight and exactness, something without precedent was preparing to take place, a disturbance in the divine arrangement that would permanently transform the cosmos. How does flawlessness become tainted? This is potentially the most profound paradox in Lucifer's narrative. In a domain of divine illumination, untouched by transgression, the darkness first manifested not from outside, but from within the core of heaven's most luminous being. Ezekiel 28-15 offers this mysterious insight. You were without blame in your conduct, from the day you were formed until wickedness was discovered in you. The enigma of this wickedness's beginning has perplexed theologians for thousands of years. There existed no outside tempter for Lucifer, no serpent in heaven's garden. The seed of uprising sprouted in pristine ground, an unparalleled anomaly in flawless creation. The initial spark of disharmony may have been understated, potentially not even acknowledged by Lucifer himself. It might have started with basic self-recognition, a natural result of his remarkable nature. Scripture portrays him as the seal of perfection, brimming with understanding and unblemished in magnificence. Such splendor would have been impossible to overlook, even to himself. Every time he carried out his celestial responsibilities, every time he guided the heavenly choirs or stood watch at the divine throne, his superiority was clear. This self-recognition, at first innocent, slowly metamorphosed. The appreciation of his own splendor quietly transformed from thanksgiving toward the Creator to admiration of the creation himself. The gift grew disconnected from the bestower in Lucifer's awareness. Where once he reflected divine illumination outward in worship, he started to bask in the glow himself, growing progressively fascinated with his own reflection. Pride in angelic beings poses a deep theological inquiry. How could creatures of such absolute intelligence and divine closeness fall victim to such a basic mistake? Unlike humans, angels do not wrestle with physical constraints or sensory interruptions. Their perception of reality is unclouded by mortal limitations. This makes Lucifer's self-deception all the more astonishing and all the more intentional. Free will in angelic beings seems to function differently than in humans. Theologians have frequently proposed that angelic decisions, once executed, are complete and irreversible. Where humans fluctuate and alter direction throughout their moral evolution, angelic choices may be eternal in their ramifications. If this holds truth, then Lucifer's internal shift towards self-adoration represented not a passing slip, but an irreversible change in trajectory, a permanent reorientation of his existence. Isaiah 14 captures the internal voice that may have echoed in Lucifer's awareness. I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will position my throne on high. I will make myself like the Most High. These 5 pronouncements of I will expose ambition in its most concentrated form. The hunger to climb beyond one's designated position, to seize authority not bestowed, to become something different from what one was formed to be. The early indicators of this ambition might have been delicate shifts in his conduct, perhaps instances of reluctance in carrying out divine instructions, or slight modifications in how he accomplished his responsibilities. He may have started to question, silently at first, the requirement of certain celestial procedures. Why should beings of such strength and intelligence be bound to seemingly random rules? Why should he, flawless in understanding, not possess greater independence in how heaven's business was handled? What makes pride so dangerous is its capacity to disguise itself as virtue. Lucifer could have readily rationalized his expanding ambition as productivity, ingenuity, or even as superior service to the divine blueprint. His understanding, once flawlessly synchronized with divine purpose, now became the instrument by which he justified his growing separation from that very purpose. In the perfect system of merit in heaven, Lucifer had genuinely earned his rank through his exceptional qualities. The deadly mistake was in neglecting to acknowledge that these qualities themselves were presence, not self-produced virtues. The illumination he carried was always and ever a mirrored illumination, not his own independent radiance. This basic misattribution, claiming ownership for what was bestowed, became the fissure through which darkness initially penetrated paradise. The most unsettling dimension of Lucifer's descent into pride was its incremental character. There was no spectacular instant of uprising, at least not at first. Instead, there was a gradual drift, a delicate reorganization of priorities and viewpoints that transpired over what might have been ages in celestial time. The most brilliant star in heaven didn't plummet in a single moment. It slowly modified its orbit, degree after imperceptible degree, until it had placed itself on a collision trajectory with the divine order itself. The divine declaration must have echoed through heaven's courts with remarkable significance. God would form a new category of being, humans. These creatures would be different from the angels in essential ways. Where angels were spirits of tremendous power and intelligence, humans would be delicate beings of dust and breath. Where angels observed creation from its commencement, humans would arrive late on the cosmic timeline. Where angels served in the immediate presence of God, humans would reside in a physical domain, the garden world being constructed for them. Most notably, these humans would possess something no other creature had, the image of God himself. "Let us form mankind in our image, in our likeness," the Creator proclaimed. This announcement represented a pivotal moment in cosmic history. Though angels held greater power, knowledge, and splendor than the intended humans would, they were not characterized as image-bearers. This difference would position humanity apart in the created arrangement. The divine blueprint further disclosed that these beings of flesh would be granted dominion over the earth, a physical domain, but one of remarkable beauty and promise. They would be charged with caring for creation, multiplying, and populating the world with their offspring. They would walk with God in an immediate relationship, though distinct from the one angels experienced in the celestial courts. How did Lucifer react to this divine undertaking? Scripture does not expressly inform us, creating space for theological contemplation. What appears probable given his later actions is that the announcement sparked a crisis within his already pride-damaged perspective. If Lucifer had started to view himself as the summit of creation, deserving of unique status and authority, the announcement of these new beings, particularly their designation as image-bearers, would have struck at the center of his self-understanding. Jealousy is too basic a term for what may have awakened within him. It was potentially a complicated blend of feelings: outrage at what he viewed as divine partiality, scorn for these inferior beings who would nevertheless possess a distinction he lacked, and a basic offense at the notion that dust-formed creatures would be raised to such prominence in the cosmic arrangement. Certain theological traditions propose that God may have disclosed even more of humanity's fate, that these beings might someday pass judgment on angels, as Paul later suggests in 1 Corinthians 6-3, or that God himself might one day assume human nature in an act of incarnation. If such disclosures were genuinely made in heaven's courts, they would have only intensified Lucifer's developing bitterness. The divine blueprint for humanity thus became the trigger that converted Lucifer's internal pride into active uprising. What had been a private reorientation of his heart now discovered an external target for its dissatisfaction. In the blueprint for humanity, Lucifer perceived what he regarded as a cosmic unfairness, one that required action. This exposes a deep theological insight about the character of his rebellion. At its foundation, Lucifer's revolt was not merely about personal aspiration, but about rejecting God's sovereign authority to arrange creation according to his understanding. It was a basic disagreement with the divine vision for the cosmos, especially humanity's position in it. Lucifer, in his self-designated understanding, assessed God's blueprint as defective and resolved to provide an alternative. His reaction likely progressed from initial astonishment to deliberate opposition. If these humans were to be so valuable to the Creator, they would become the ideal target for his expanding rebellion. If they genuinely were central to God's cosmic blueprint, then tainting them would deliver the most substantial blow against that blueprint. Their free will, that divine present that made them image-bearers, would become the weakness he would take advantage of. Thus, the divine undertaking to form humanity became unintentionally the catalyst for Lucifer's ultimate break with heaven's unity. What God planned as a magnificent expansion of his loving creation became, through Lucifer's twisted perspective, the rationalization for cosmic revolt. The morning star, once heaven's most brilliant, now positioned himself against the very origin of light itself. All because he could not embrace his position in a universe where dust-formed creatures possessed the divine image he desired. The theological reasoning behind Lucifer's rebellion thus focuses on a basic rejection of God's sovereign understanding, a creature presuming to comprehend better than the Creator how the cosmos should be arranged. It was, in essence, the initial attempt at cosmic revolution, a bid to overthrow not merely a ruler, but reality itself as divinely established. Rebellion seldom declares itself with fanfare. More frequently it starts with murmurs, with inquiries skillfully presented, with delicate reinterpretations of established truths. So it was in heaven's courts, as Lucifer started the meticulous, deliberate work of distributing dissent among the angelic assembly. Having completely embraced his opposition to God's blueprint, especially concerning humanity, Lucifer embarked on a campaign without precedent in celestial history. He who had guided heavenly choirs in adoration now crafted a different melody, one of uncertainty, discontent, and enticing promises of independence. The light-bearer became, strangely, the initial distributor of shadows. We can only theorize about the precise nature of his convincing methods, but they must have been exceptional. Angels, beings of deep intelligence and divine closeness, would not be readily influenced from their purpose. Lucifer would have required arguments of remarkable sophistication, customized to each category of angel he attempted to enlist. To the angels responsible for administering divine justice, he might have proposed that God's blueprint for humanity represented a compromise of cosmic principles. These vulnerable creatures would unavoidably fail, introducing chaos to creation. To those accountable for divine adoration, he could have hinted that sharing splendor with dust-formed beings reduced the purity of heaven's devotion. To angels of knowledge and understanding, he perhaps suggested that God was concealing deeper truths, restricting their capacity for complete understanding. The genius of Lucifer's approach likely rested in its gradual nature. He would not have instantly proposed open uprising, but rather a reformation of heaven's arrangement. Perhaps he presented his movement as a required correction, a restoration of appropriate celestial hierarchy that would ultimately serve the greater benefit. Revolution camouflaged as renaissance. His magnetism cannot be exaggerated. As heaven's most magnificent being, glowing with splendor and holding unparalleled eloquence, Lucifer would have demanded natural attention and respect. When he voiced his thoughts, others paid attention. When he raised questions, others pondered. When he proposed alternative understandings of divine instructions, many discovered his logic persuasive. His very superiority, the present that should have most honored his creator, became the instrument of his sedition. Scripture suggests the magnitude of his achievement. Revelation 12:4 speaks in symbolic language of his tail, dragging a third of the stars from heaven, customarily understood as a third of the angelic assembly joining his rebellion. If correct, this represents an remarkable achievement of persuasion, convincing innumerable celestial beings to relinquish their formed purpose for his alternative vision. Who were these angels that turned from divine service to follow Lucifer? They extended across all ranks and orders, from mighty powers near the throne to lesser protectors of cosmic territories. Some may have joined from aspiration, recognizing opportunity for progression in a reorganized heaven. Others potentially were authentically persuaded by his reasoning, believing themselves to be standing for a superior principle. Still, others may have been attracted by his sheer magnetic presence, carried along in the current of celestial politics without completely grasping the consequences. As his sway expanded, Lucifer's own transformation quickened. With each new recruit to his cause, his opposition to divine authority hardened. What started as private discontent solidified into determined purpose. The morning star was now completely dedicated to climbing higher, to founding his own dominion, to implementing his alternative vision for cosmic arrangement. Gatherings would have been conducted in distant celestial provinces, away from the immediate radiance of the throne. Blueprints would have been established, approaches developed, celestial territories quietly claimed. A shadow government took shape within the government of heaven, awaiting the instant to surface into the open. Divine intelligence was redirected towards subversion. Angelic strength was quietly channeled toward approaching conflict. The most heartbreaking dimension of this assembling rebellion was its basic futility. Beings of such intelligence could not have been entirely unaware that opposition to omnipotence was destined to fail. Yet pride possesses this quality. It blinds even the brilliant to evident truth. As Lucifer's rebellion took form, reality itself was compelled to bend around his delusion, generating the cosmic equivalent of mass psychosis among beings formed for flawless reason. Throughout this period of expanding sedition, the divine reaction appears to have been patience. God, all-knowing and all-seeing, certainly watched each development in Lucifer's campaign, yet no swift judgment descended. The angelic rebels were granted time, perhaps as a display of divine mercy, perhaps as a final chance to reconsider their trajectory. Heaven held its breath as the unthinkable developed within its flawless unity. An alternative loyalty, a competing vision, the initial political opposition in a kingdom of absolute unity, the unthinkable ultimately materialized. War broke out in heaven. The domain of absolute peace transformed into a battleground as Lucifer's long-developing rebellion exploded into open conflict. What had commenced as whispered dissent now manifested as the cosmos's initial violence. The Book of Revelation captures this remarkable moment with blunt imagery. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. The character of this celestial conflict resists complete human comprehension. This was not warfare as we understand it, with physical weapons and bodily wounds. Rather, it was a collision of wills and authorities, of powers beyond mortal grasp. Angels, beings of pure spirit and tremendous capability, directed their energies not towards service, but destruction for the initial time since creation's beginning. Guiding the loyalist forces stood Michael the archangel, whose very designation poses a challenge to the rebels. Who is like God? His question was both battle cry and theological refutation of Lucifer's fundamental presumption. Michael represented flawless angelic reaction to divine authority, unwavering obedience combined with intense devotion. Where Lucifer had distorted his presence towards self-glorification, Michael channeled his substantial power completely toward protecting divine sovereignty. Under Michael's leadership fought angels from every heavenly rank who had stayed faithful. Seraphim temporarily paused their eternal adoration to enter the conflict. Cherubim abandoned their posts as protectors to become warriors. Powers and dominions arranged the celestial armies according to divine battle blueprints never before required in paradise. The rebel forces, guided by Lucifer, now progressively identified as the dragon, Satan, the adversary, assembled their substantial strength. Though outnumbered 2-1, if we embrace the third of the stars as literal, they compensated with fury and desperation. These fallen angels fought not merely against their former brothers, but against reality itself, against the very arrangement of existence that defined their original purpose. What weapons were deployed in this cosmic struggle? Scripture provides glimpses rather than comprehensive accounts. Revelation speaks of the accuser being thrown down by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. This implies that truth itself was weaponized against deception, suggests that divine reality was brought to bear against angelic delusion. Other biblical passages hint at flaming swords and thunderbolts of judgment, though these may be symbolic representations of spiritual powers rather than literal implements of war. The battleground extended throughout celestial domains. Perhaps it commenced near the boundary of heaven, in those territories where Lucifer had initially established his shadow authority, then pushed relentlessly toward the center, toward the throne itself. Each advance by the loyal angels reclaimed territory for divine arrangement. Each desperate counterattack by the rebels attempted to preserve their doomed revolution. The conflict may have unfolded across multiple dimensions of reality at once. In some aspects, it was surely a philosophical war, truth against falsehood, divine understanding against created intelligence turned inward. In others, it manifested as a struggle for dominion over celestial provinces and functions. In still others, it represented the initial cosmic sorting, the separation of those who would serve from those who would rebel, a division with eternal ramifications. Throughout this remarkable struggle, God himself remains curiously absent from direct participation in most theological understandings. The Father delegates the defense of heaven to Michael and the loyal angels, perhaps as a final display that created beings can genuinely choose rightly, that free will need not unavoidably lead to rebellion. The loyal angels' victory would stand as eternal testimony that service to divine purpose is not forced, but freely selected. The tide of battle inexorably shifted against the rebels. No matter their intensity or tactical genius, they fought against both superior numbers and, more conclusively, against the basic nature of reality itself. Creation was organized to flourish in unity with its creator's blueprint. Rebellion was, by definition, an attempt to function outside that blueprint, a cosmic impossibility. Lucifer's defeat arrived not merely as military failure, but as ontological inevitability. His attempt to found an alternative to God's authority could be temporarily entertained, but never ultimately maintained in a universe where that very authority establishes the foundation of existence. The rebel angels discovered themselves fighting not merely against loyal opponents, but against the very fabric of the reality they attempted to reshape. The instant of decisive victory is captured in Revelation's vivid imagery. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was thrown to the earth, and his angels with him. With terrible finality, the failed revolutionaries were expelled from heaven's heights. The morning star, who had aspired to climb above the divine throne, instead tumbled into the deeper darkness of exile. As the celestial conflict concluded, heaven itself was transformed. What had been a domain of absolute unity now contained the memory of division. What had been unmarred unity now resonated with the historical note of discord. Yet in another sense, heaven emerged cleansed, not reduced, but clarified. Those who remained had faced the ultimate decision and reconfirmed their devotion to divine purpose. The loyalty of Michael and his angels, freely given in the face of genuine alternative, represented a deeper commitment than unchallenged obedience could display. With Lucifer's fall, a chapter in celestial history closed, but a new and darker chapter in cosmic struggle was merely beginning. The war had not concluded. It had merely shifted venues. The battlefield would relocate from heaven's courts to a newer, more vulnerable theater of operations, the garden world being constructed for those image-bearers whose very formation had sparked Lucifer's fateful rebellion. It occurred in an instant that seemed like eternity. One moment, heaven blazed with flawless unity. The next, it splintered like broken crystal. The war was finished before it even started. A rebellion crushed not by overpowering force, but by the sheer devastating weight of truth against a falsehood. Lucifer, the morning star, who once stood at the summit of angelic magnificence and radiance, discovered himself torn from the highest heights, hurled headlong into the chasm. The book of Revelation speaks in enigmas of it. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon fought, and his angels, but they prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. Lucifer the dragon was expelled, and with him a third of the hosts of heaven, ripped from splendor, stripped of their radiance, thrown into exile. No discussion, no clemency. Michael, the war captain of the loyalists, guided the charge. Tradition maintains he spoke only 6 words before the initial blow was delivered. Who is like God, a designation and a battle cry simultaneously. Lucifer's army, once shimmering like a constellation in their own right, shattered apart like dust dispersed before a tempest. Those who accompanied him, once numbered among the blessed, now became something else completely. Their forms contorted, their light snuffed out. They became a parody of their former selves. Fallen angels, demons, the initial exiles of creation. Lucifer himself, wounded in pride more than body, plummeted downward, not through a location, but through a state of existence. From pure spirit to tainted will, from elevation to isolation, from prince to outcast. Isaiah's sorrowful mockery resonates across millennia. How have you plummeted from heaven, O Lucifer, offspring of the morning? How have you been cut down to the ground, you who did weaken the nations? In that instant, all the golden promises of rebellion transformed to ashes. The universe shuddered, the spiritual wound gaped open, order re-established itself above. But below, in the churning spaces outside heaven, a new domain coalesced. A grim, smoking mirror of the divine arrangement. Hell, not a throne Lucifer seized by strength, but a pit he excavated with his own pride. Not a kingdom bestowed, but a prison he refused to recognize. Even then, he refused surrender. Fallen, shattered, enraged, he designated himself anew. Satan, the adversary, the accuser, the enemy. He wore exile as a crown, vengeance as a robe, and vowed that if he could not climb to God's throne, he would drag all of creation down with him. It was not a defeat he embraced. It was a declaration of endless war. The fall was not merely physical, it was ontological. Lucifer's very nature transformed. Once the carrier of light, he became its annihilator, consumed by the fire of his own envy and hatred. Where he once sang the melodies of heaven, he now whispered in shadows, sowing uncertainty, fear, rebellion. Where he once mirrored divine splendor, he now sought only to pervert, taint, invert. No apology was extended, no repentance pursued. Lucifer's fall was absolute because he selected it to be absolute, clinging to pride even as it annihilated him. And so the greatest tragedy of creation was sealed, not by a sword or decree, but by choice. A choice echoed 1,000,000 times, since by innumerable others. The reverberations of that initial rebellion ripple through every act of defiance, every betrayal, every turning from the light. In the architecture of heaven, Lucifer's absence created a scar, a vacant place where radiance had been. In the architecture of the cosmos, his fall introduced entropy, conflict, death itself. His rebellion fractured the mirror of creation, and the fracture lines have never completely healed. Legends claim the earth itself bears the impact scars of his fall, the ancient places where the heavens once touched the mountains. Others claim the ocean's depths hide gateways to the chasm, hidden wounds where Lucifer's bitterness still leaks into the world. Wherever he descended, it was not the conclusion. It was the commencement of a different campaign, one fought not against heaven directly, but through its most vulnerable creation, humanity. Lucifer understood he could not charge heaven's gates again, but he could assault its reflection, its image, its beloved, mankind. And so he waited his time, gathering hatred like embers, plotting devastation on a cosmic scale. The designation Lucifer would seldom be uttered again. He had erased it himself. Satan, the devil, the dragon, the accuser. These were the titles he selected through action, not inheritance. His memory was woven into mythologies across the earth. the trickster, the fallen hero, the dark tempter. Cultures divided by oceans and mountains still told in whispers the narrative of the bright being who challenged the Most High and paid the price. Some pitied him, imagining him a misunderstood revolutionary. Some loathed him, seeing only the corrupter of innocence, but all in one way or another remembered. He became at last what he had accused God of being, a tyrant, a deceiver, a jailer. The difference was that God's authority was rooted in love, while Lucifer's was birthed of spite. He did not offer freedom, he offered only chains disguised as crowns. He did not guide, he poisoned. He did not create, he vandalized. And through it all, he wore his fall like a badge of honor, a twisted relic of his former splendor. He would not kneel, he would not repent, he would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. And by his own hand, he ensured that was the only kingdom remaining to him. Beneath the surface of every golden age, every empire, every throne, the shadow of that initial rebellion lurked, not in fire and brimstone, but in whispered promises of power, whispered uncertainties about authority, whispered dreams of impossible thrones. And Lucifer, the initial revolutionary, waited there in the cracks, patient, bitter, timeless. His war was no longer a clash of angelic hosts. It was an infection of souls, one heart at a time. The war was finished. The war had merely begun. The fall did not conclude with the descent. Lucifer's exile from heaven was not simply a relocation. It was a transformation of essence. What plummeted to the earth was no longer the light-bringer, the radiant morning star adorned in celestial brilliance, but something completely new, completely opposed to what he had once been. This was not a demotion, it was a metamorphosis. The one who had stood near the throne of the Almighty, whose magnificence once mirrored divine craftsmanship, became the adversary, the accuser, the ancient serpent. Expelled from the realm of absolute purity, he carried more than just the burden of disgrace. He bore a seared mark of heavenly repudiation. The place he once called home transformed into a recollection tinged with bitterness and rage. The identity Lucifer dissolved, vanishing like a rank torn from a dishonored commander. In its stead emerged the designation Satan, a label not signifying individual identity but operational purpose, the one who stands in opposition. Where Lucifer had previously conveyed illumination, Satan now transported darkness. Where he had formerly mirrored God's magnificence, he now challenged it openly. Within the very act of insurrection, something permanent took hold inside him. Pride ceased to murmur softly. It roared with intensity. Envy stopped simmering quietly. It ignited completely. The heavenly flames that had previously brightened him from deep within now warped, charred, and devoured. His longings soured into thoughts of retribution. His mental capacity, formerly synchronized with sacred understanding, now schemed, undermining activities. His handsomeness transformed into trickery. His speech became a trap. He didn't merely descend. He rotated away. A being crafted for splendor now existed for destruction and ruin. No longer satisfied with being barred from heaven's sovereignty, he redirected his rage toward those bearing God's likeness, humanity itself. Through his metamorphosis, he reformulated his approach. A frontal attack against the celestial realm had proven unsuccessful. Strength alone could not overthrow the supreme being. However, another arena of conflict remained available: the terrestrial world. The freshly formed domain of human beings, fashioned from earth, yet adorned with autonomous choice, became the terrain where Satan would conduct his genuine battle. If ascending to God's seat proved impossible, he would mar his handiwork instead. Not through military forces, but through concepts. Not through physical violence, but through falsification. If ruling in paradise was denied him, he would dominate within human souls. The Holy Writings do not specify precisely when this alteration in designation took place, yet the terminology is crystal clear. Satan surfaces not as an identifier among peers, but as a function positioned against paradise. In the Hebrew tongue, Hasatan translates to the one who accuses, a legal opponent in a universal tribunal. From opponent to hostile force, this character was shaped not through origin but through decision, constant, unrelenting, confirmed through defiance. He ceased being merely one among countless others. He transformed into the solitary adversary of everything sacred. This transformation also affected relationships. Satan no longer operated as a single being among a multitude. He commanded a collapsed realm. Additional celestial messengers, attracted by his magnetism and tainted by his mission, accompanied him into banishment. Their radiance diminished, their calling inverted. They ceased functioning as carriers of brightness and became tools of disorientation instead. The descended did not disperse randomly. They restructured themselves. They evolved into a shadowy reflection of the divine arrangement, a perverted imitation of paradise's structure. Positions of authority, territories, and hierarchies persisted, yet their allegiances had transformed. These now served as operatives of deterioration, no longer of formation. Within this reverse domain, Satan reigned absolute, not as a gracious sovereign but as an oppressor, bound by fixation. His solitary objective, to pull all creation toward rebellion, to saturate the world with reverberations of his arrogance. The shift into Satan was not an outfit donned or a disguise assumed. It represented an internal disintegration of intention, a resistance so profound it reconstructed his essence. The previously sanctified cherub became the pattern for wickedness, not simply standing against God, but fundamentally misaligned with reality, grace, and existence itself. Even his techniques carried the signature of distortion. Satan does not bring forth anything new. He produces imitations. He grasps what is genuine and distorts it. He imitates brightness to conceal his true character. He communicates not to bring clarity, but to generate bewilderment. He entices, not with restraints, but with assurances. He grasps that misleading proves more productive than outright control. Through this lens, the transformation encompasses not only spiritual dimensions, but strategic ones as well. He retains celestial strength, yet possesses infernal intent. The Book of Revelation describes him as the dragon, the ancient serpent. This representation, reptilian and primordial, conveys more than literary embellishment. It indicates the persistence of insurrection. The identical entity who once stood, clothed in magnificence, now moves through shadows, from the peaks of the celestial realm to the soil of paradise. He transports with him the understanding gained from heaven, yet employs it as an instrument against the pure. He presents himself as a messenger of brilliance, not to remind humanity of truth, but to lead them astray. The descent removed his legitimate power, though not his shrewdness. His transformation did not represent a reduction of capability, but a perversion of it. Still, his ultimate failure was never uncertain. The descent was not a confrontation lost, but a verdict rendered. His continued presence now unfolds within parameters established by the very deity he betrayed. He possesses strength, yet operates only as permitted. He advances but solely within boundaries marked by supreme authority. Even while rebelling, he fulfills a function, not through willingness, but through inevitability. His position transforms into that of the examiner, the purifier, through whose presence decisions become apparent. In becoming Satan, he evolved into the unintentional trigger of human ethical consciousness. His fabrications brought truth into sharper focus. His obscurity magnified the radiance. His enticements refined the determination of the devoted. Across the passage of time, the conception of Satan grew more elaborate. In sacred texts, he develops from the celestial prosecutor in Job's story to the one tempting Christ in the barren wilderness. From indirect resistance to explicit combat, the transformation proceeds not solely in theological understanding, but in storytelling progression. He becomes a monstrous dragon in Revelation, a predatory lion searching for victims to consume in Peter's correspondence, a universal accuser in Zechariah's visions. His character solidifies into that of the supreme opponent, not exclusively against the divine, but against the emerging narrative of salvation. The most profound deception he ever constructed was not the claim that God lacks existence, but rather that humankind could achieve divinity independently of him. This fabrication, initially murmured in paradise, reverberates through every enticement that came afterward. It mirrors not simply his tactical approach, but his core nature. Satan does not attempt to eliminate God's principles. He aims to flip them completely. He does not set fire to the sacred place. He positions himself within it, asserting divine status. His transformation reaches completion when he stops denying paradise altogether, but instead claims to be its legitimate sovereign. Therefore, the account of Lucifer's transformation into Satan transcends mere rebellion narrative. It stands as a principle carved into spiritual existence. That magnificence divorced from modest submission crumbles inward. That splendor separated from faithful adherence deteriorates. That drive untethered from higher calling consumes its own foundation. This chronicles a being who witnessed flawlessness and craved ownership, who existed in eternity's presence and grasped for authority that was never intended for him. Through that grasping motion, he plummeted, not toward feebleness but toward fury, not toward obscurity but toward conflict. And through that plunge, the daybreak celestial body was snuffed out, substituted by a darkness that continues, walking among humanity. Not in physical manifestation, but in ideology, in structural systems, in quiet suggestions telling you that you answer to yourself alone, that you serve as your own deity. Lucifer's shift into Satan is not remote, ancient legend. It serves as the pattern for every descent from honor. It represents the spiritual framework of excessive pride. It stands as the initial reflection, cautioning what happens to the created being who loses sight of the one who created. The morning celestial body plummeted like electrical discharge, yet the reverberations of his downfall still thunder through the ages. The world existed in its infancy, pristine, a garden unmarred by wounds. Paradise stretched out beneath flawless skies, where waterways wove silvery pathways through fields of emerald brilliance, and creatures wandered freely without terror of tooth or talon. At the heart of this sanctuary stood two beings, humankind in its initial moment of existence, Adam and Eve, unclothed, yet feeling no embarrassment, adorned with purity. Beyond them loomed a timeless, invisible strain, a break concealed within the radiance. For not everything remained peaceful past the visible boundary. Lucifer, previously the most luminous celestial body, now the resentful designer of resistance, operated with fresh determination. His plummet had taken away Paradise's approval, yet not his cleverness, and thoughts of vengeance smouldered cold and deliberate within his being. His conflict had collapsed in the skies above. At this moment he would conduct it from the concealed places of the terrestrial realm. He could not assault God in a direct manner, yet he could damage his greatest work, taint the newly formed children, pull them toward insurrection, force them to experience identical condemnation. Lucifer's initial instrument was fraudulence, and his selected vessel was the serpent, timeless representation of understanding perverted into betrayal. Not a simple snake as witnessed in modern times, but a being of peculiar majesty, perhaps even luminous, possibly walking erect before its coming curse. Through this vessel Lucifer slid into Paradise's core. At the garden's center flourished two trees, the tree granting life, providing perpetual vitality, and the tree imparting knowledge of virtue and wickedness, prohibited by sacred decree. Here is where Lucifer executed his strategy, constructing words as meticulously as a spider weaves its snare. He came near to Eve, not with frightfulness but with allure, not of bodily form but of mental persuasion. "Did God truly command you to avoid eating from every tree within the garden?" he inquired, pretending naivety, introducing uncertainty. Eve, caught off guard yet experiencing no fear, set him straight. They possessed freedom to consume from all except a single tree, for making contact with the tree of knowledge would result in death. Lucifer's answer slithered profoundly into her awareness. "You will certainly not perish, for God understands that upon consuming it, your perception will expand, and you will resemble God, comprehending virtue and wickedness." In that instant, a crack split through her confidence. Lucifer presented a toxic offering: independence, understanding, divine status, wrapped as emancipation. He portrayed faithful obedience as lack of awareness, yielding as bondage, and caused rebellion to appear like true freedom. Eve gazed upon the fruit with fresh perspective. It appeared attractive, appealing, and suddenly essential. The initial enticement was not physical appetite, but aspiration, the craving to rise, to exist as divine beings. Eve grasped and consumed. In performing this action, she destroyed creation's purity. She passed the fruit to Adam, who likewise consumed, confirming humanity's destiny. In a single heartbeat, paradise ceased being a refuge and became a place of judgment instead. Recognition flooded through them like an ascending wave of humiliation. They perceived their exposure and rushed to shield themselves using fig foliage. Paradise, previously unblemished, now carried the stain of comprehending wrongdoing, and they concealed themselves from the one whose presence formerly delivered gladness. God's arrival was not the fury of a dictator, but the grief of a parent facing betrayal. "Where have you gone?" he voiced, not through lack of awareness, but through lamentation. When facing questions, Adam assigned blame to Eve. Eve assigned blame to the serpent. The sequence of culpability commenced. God declared consequences. The serpent would move on its belly and consume dirt. Eve would experience anguish during childbirth and yield to her spouse. Adam would struggle against cursed soil for sustenance. Death, genuine death, separation from sacred life, penetrated the world. Lucifer's sabotage had reached fulfillment. However, triumph tasted acrid. For while cursing the serpent, God also voiced prediction. The offspring of the woman would someday crush the serpent's skull, even while it wounded his foot. A coming settlement was initiated. An extended conflict of bloodshed and spirit extending across successive generations. Lucifer had claimed a skirmish, yet sparked a war that would reverberate into perpetuity. Adam and Eve faced expulsion, cast toward the east of paradise, the gateway secured by cherubim wielding blazing weapons. Humanity would roam, injured yet longing, tormented by recollection of forfeited perfection. Meanwhile, Lucifer assumed the role of prince, commanding the power of atmospheric realms, master of a domain of shattered spirits, designer of rebellion throughout humanity. He would assume numerous identities through historical progression: tempter, prosecutor, misleader, annihilator. Yet paradise was the origin point of everything, where a murmured fabrication overturned a world, and arrogance, masquerading as understanding, lured humanity toward the chasm. The dissent was not simply disobedience. It was an act of betrayal, a proclamation that humankind would prefer governing in damnation over serving in paradise. Within one acrid fruit, awareness and mortality became inseparably linked. And orchestrating everything, invisible yet directing, Lucifer observed with frigid contentment as the perfect garden deteriorated under the pressure of decision. He had not raised a blade or caused a single drop of blood to spill. He had merely constructed a narrative containing sufficient truth to mask the fabrication, sufficient toxin to corrupt the spirit. It was the initial and most lethal instrument ever utilized. It would not constitute the final one. The soil of paradise had scarcely stabilized when the darkness returned, not through thunder or combustion, but through quietness. The serpent who previously murmured to Eve now moved unseen through human consciousness. Cain and Abel, the offspring of Adam and Eve, became the initial inheritors of a fractured reality. One characterized by the awareness of virtue and wickedness, by labor and bloodshed, by removal from the sacred presence. Abel showed honor to the Lord with a heart uncorrupted and a gift found acceptable, while Cain, the firstborn, presented his contribution with bitterness coiled deeply within his being. God, perceiving through both gift and motivation, welcomed Abel's offering and declined Cain's. This was not dismissal. It was a test, an opportunity to elevate beyond the murmur that moved within him. Wrongdoing crouches at the entrance, God cautioned Cain. Its attraction is toward you, yet you must gain control over it. However, wrongdoing had already established residence within him. The identical voice that previously assured Eve she could achieve divine status now whispered to Cain that he had experienced injustice, that retribution rested in his personal grasp, that a sibling's blood would restore equilibrium. And therefore, in a field distant from observation, Cain rose up against Abel and killed him. The ground, young and still quivering with sacred breath, parted to accept the initial blood. It absorbed deeply and cried out toward paradise. God arrived, not through anger but through anguish. Where is your sibling? Cain's response, rebellious, emotionless, disconnected. Am I responsible for my brother's welfare? This marked the initial occasion a human being lied in direct address to God. Yet underneath that fabrication existed a more profound reality. Cain had yielded to the very influence his parents had released, the identical desire to ascend that had infected the morning celestial body. This was Lucifer's achievement, not through a blazing conflict, but through a solitary fraternal killing. No serpent required to strike when jealousy accomplished the task. From this instant, the contamination expanded like vapor through successive generations. The teaching was transparent. Rebellion did not require military forces. It required only suffering and arrogance, and therefore Cain was branded not solely for consequences, but for commemoration. He was forced to roam, the initial exile of the fresh world. Scholars of theology have extensively contemplated, was Lucifer the force behind the deed? The Bible does not identify him in this passage, yet the arrangement corresponds. The planting of conflict, the murmur of unfairness, the gradual contamination of understanding. Abel, without fault, became the initial person to die for truth. Cain, the initial representation of tainted humanity. Their parents, who previously walked alongside God, now mourned over a burial site they never thought conceivable. This was not merely the account of two siblings. It was the commencement of spiritual combat within the human consciousness. From this moment forward, the descendants of Adam would transport both the recollection of paradise and the burden of the descent, torn between God's voice and the murmur of the opponent. Cain's account was the reverberation of Lucifer's personal story. One selected, one raised up, one granted magnificence, and subsequently one who turned internally, who maintained he was treated unjustly, who responded to perceived unfairness with annihilation. The arena of conflict was no longer the celestial realm. It had now become the human consciousness. Every killing, every act of betrayal, every acrid utterance across time would mirror this pattern. Injured arrogance, perverted longing, a voice that declares, "You possess that entitlement." Lucifer did not require physical appearance to shape humanity. His rebellion had evolved into a contagion within the human essence. Cain's inheritance was not solely the killing of kin, it was the acceptance of self-importance as supreme. The seed had been planted. The garden had truly been forfeited, not solely in geographical terms, but in fundamental character. There would exist no return through backward movement. And still, the sacred presence persisted. God's voice never abandoned humanity, even during their most terrible deeds. However, he would not override autonomous decision. For affection without liberty is enslavement, and faithful obedience without alternative is meaningless. Cain had selected a path, and his selection would reverberate across successive generations. The curse was not solely the brand. It was the internal agitation, the awareness that something valuable had been destroyed. And Lucifer, though invisible, would appear repeatedly, not consistently with fabrications but with partial truths. Not consistently as a serpent, but sometimes as sibling, companion, or one's own self. The initial killing was not solely a transgression. It was the origin of recorded events as we comprehend it, a prolonged descent from purity, a conflict between what exists and what was intended to exist. Cain did not function independently. He functioned as the human instrument of a spiritual rebellion more ancient than time itself. In that instant, the descent of celestial beings intersected with the descent of humanity, and therefore the conflict proceeded, not in the celestial spheres but in fields, within families, and inside consciousness. In the successive generations that came after Adam and Eve's removal from paradise, humanity's connection with wrongdoing intensified. The obscurity that had initially penetrated through arrogance and rebellious behavior began to expand across the terrestrial realm, like a shadow at twilight, progressively, then abruptly consuming everything. Sacred texts inform us the Lord witnessed how immense the corruption of the human population had grown on the terrestrial realm, and that every tendency of the contemplations of the human consciousness was solely wickedness continuously. This was not simply ethical breakdown, but a methodical contamination that brought sorrow to the Creator within his core. What function did Lucifer fulfill in this declining trajectory? The scriptural text indicates a complicated interaction between human selection and spiritual shaping. While humans carried accountability for their deeds, the opponent labored persistently, murmuring in willing ears, cultivating the seeds of selfishness that had been introduced in paradise. Like a methodical cultivator of deterioration, he observed as brutality substituted for kindness and manipulation substituted for care of the terrestrial realm. It was throughout this shadowy period that one of the most enigmatic sections of Genesis surfaces. A mysterious allusion to entities identified as the Nephilim. The Nephilim existed on the terrestrial realm in those periods, and likewise following, when the offspring of God went to the female descendants of humans and produced children through them. They were the champions of ancient times, individuals of great reputation. This concise reference has generated centuries of theological discussion and conjecture. Who were these offspring of God? What were the Nephilim? The Book of Enoch, a non-canonical text nevertheless referenced in the New Testament letter of Jude, provides expansion on this mysterious section. Based on this ancient Jewish composition, a collective of celestial beings identified as the Watchers rebelled against Paradise's structure by claiming human spouses and imparting prohibited understanding to humanity. Their descendants were the Nephilim, powerful hybrid entities of remarkable magnitude and strength who introduced additional contamination to the terrestrial realm. Whether someone comprehends these narratives in literal terms or as symbols, they communicate a significant reality. Lucifer's insurrection was not limited to his person. Just as he had guided celestial messengers into error in paradise, he persisted in extending his rebellion on the terrestrial realm, generating fresh manifestations of contamination and chaos. The arrangement established in paradise, the introduction of chaos through misleading, was manifesting on a worldwide magnitude. As brutality and corruption controlled the pre-Diluvian reality, humanity drifted increasingly distant from their Creator's blueprint. The text informs us, God experienced regret that he had fashioned human beings on the terrestrial realm. This moving expression of sacred sorrow discloses the degree of the contamination, Lucifer, having been unsuccessful in ascending to God's position of authority, had instead dragged creation in a downward direction, away from its designated magnificence. The limited number who remained devoted faced staggering resistance. Enoch walked in faithfulness with God before being transported immediately to paradise. Noah discovered approval in God's perception amid universal contamination. These rare cases only accentuated the general rule. Humanity had predominantly yielded to obscurity. The opponent, though incapable of bringing forth new creation, had demonstrated remarkably successful at annihilation, and therefore the waters arrived. The immense deluge, whether comprehended as worldwide or confined to a region, signifies a sacred restart, a cleansing away of contamination that had attained insufferable degrees. Yet even this disastrous action did not remove the spiritual conflict. Lucifer persisted, and human character still transported the susceptibility to wrongdoing. The deluge purified the terrestrial realm, yet the conflict continued. The morning celestial body's plunge had sparked a confrontation that would extend across all of human recorded events. Following the water's withdrawal and Noah's family's repopulation of the terrestrial realm, humanity would quickly uncover that Lucifer's approaches had endured the deluge. The arrangement of rebellion would persist, assuming fresh manifestations, yet following the identical fundamental pattern, the raising of human desire above sacred understanding, the craving for divine-like strength without divine-like moral fiber. And in no location would this arrangement become more apparent than in the darkness of an immense tower extending toward paradise. The waters of the deluge had withdrawn, and humanity had received another opportunity. The terrestrial realm was restored, and Noah's descendants commenced to increase in number and disperse across its surface. However, the opponent's shaping had not been cleansed away alongside the waters. The identical essence that had murmured to Eve in the garden and contaminated the pre-Diluvian reality quickly discovered expression in a fresh manifestation of rebellion. Subsequently, they declared, "Come, allow us to construct for ourselves a settlement with a tower extending to the celestial realms. Therefore, we may establish a reputation for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be dispersed across the surface of the entire terrestrial realm." In these utterances from Genesis chapter 11, we witness reverberations of Lucifer's initial wrongdoing, the craving to raise oneself, to establish a reputation independent of the one who creates. The similarities are remarkable. Just as Lucifer had declared within his consciousness, "I will rise to paradise. I will position my position of authority beyond the celestial bodies of God." At this moment, humans attempted to construct a physical structure that would extend to the celestial realms. The Tower of Babel signifies more than structural aspiration. It was a calculated resistance of God's instruction to populate the terrestrial realm. Instead of dispersing outward as directed, humanity assembled collectively in a solitary location, resolved to generate a structure to their personal magnificence. The tower was to be topped with its peak in the celestial realms, terminology evocative of celestial religion, and potentially an initial manifestation of the stellar veneration that would subsequently characterize numerous ancient societies. Was Lucifer, in a direct manner, participating in motivating this rebellion? Sacred texts do not specifically state this, yet the theological arrangement is transparent. The essence of rebellion that had characterized Lucifer's plunge now motivated human civilization. The craving to resemble God that had enticed Eve now revealed itself as structural arrogance. The arrogant self-raising that had converted the bearer of brightness into the opponent now propelled humanity to construct a reputation for themselves separate from their one who creates. The tower itself presumably resembled a ziggurat, a substantial stepped pyramid widespread in ancient Mesopotamia. These structures were crowned with sanctuaries devoted to guardian deities and were perceived as connections between terrestrial realm and paradise. The contradiction is significant. While trying to extend toward the sacred through human exertion, the constructors were genuinely engaging in the most ancient rebellion, the effort to claim sacred privilege through arrogance. God's reaction to the tower discloses what was threatened. If, as a unified population, communicating the identical language, they have commenced to perform this, subsequently, nothing they intend to perform will be unattainable for them. This declaration indicates not acceptance, but apprehension. Cohesion, divorced from yielding to sacred understanding, becomes hazardous. A teaching Lucifer personally had illustrated in Paradise when he brought together a third portion of the celestial messengers in rebellion. The mixing of language at Babel was not sacred possessiveness, but rather a compassionate action, preventing humanity from hastening increasingly down a harmful trajectory. The similarities between Babel and Lucifer's plunge extend to the result as well. Just as the rebellious celestial messengers were dispersed from Paradise, the tower constructors were dispersed across the terrestrial realm. Just as universal balance was interrupted by the initial rebellion, human cohesion was broken by arrogance. The mixing of languages, the incapacity to comprehend one another, transformed into a physical demonstration of the spiritual conflict that commenced when creation rotated from its one who creates. Babel would not constitute the final such effort at rebellion. Throughout recorded events, dominions would ascend with comparable aspirations. From Babylon itself extending to Rome, from Nazi Germany to any structure that positions human magnificence beyond sacred intention. Each would carry the identifying marks of Lucifer's initial rebellion, and each would, in the end, face the identical destiny as the tower, breakdown, and failure. Yet alongside sacred verdict arrived sacred compassion. The dispersing of population collectives resulted in the variety of societies that would, in the end, accomplish its initial instruction to populate the terrestrial realm. And from a single one of these dispersed populations, a male identified as Abram from the Chaldeans, God would commence to reveal the subsequent portion in his restorative design. The opponent had motivated a tower of arrogance, yet God would construct something considerably more substantial, an agreement of unearned favor. As the tower dissolved into recorded events, transforming into no more than a warning narrative, Lucifer's resistance to sacred intentions proceeded without decrease. The arena of conflict would transfer to the existences of patriarchs and those who speak for God, monarchs, and ordinary individuals. And as human civilization expanded and progressed, therefore too would the comprehension of the immense adversary develop and shift across varying religious traditions. The being we identify as Lucifer experienced significant transformations as religious contemplation progressed across varied cultures and traditions. What commenced as dispersed allusions to a descended celestial being in ancient Hebrew texts would develop into an intricate character, filling a primary position in religious understanding of the universe. The opponent's representation varies substantially across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, mirroring each tradition's theological priorities and cultural backgrounds. In initial Jewish contemplation, Hasatan was not at first the universal rebel of subsequent tradition. The designation itself translates to the one who accuses or the opponent, and surfaces in the Hebrew Bible not as an actual identifier but as a function, a legal prosecutor in God's celestial tribunal. In the Book of Numbers, the celestial messenger who faces Balaam is identified as Satan, not due to being wicked but due to standing in resistance. This operational comprehension, Satan as one who opposes instead of personification of wickedness, characterizes substantial portions of initial Jewish contemplation. The progression from operational opponent to universal adversary transpired progressively throughout the Second Temple interval, 516, before the Common Era extending to 70 in the Common Era, shaped partially by interaction with Persian dualism throughout the Babylonian removal. In apocalyptic written works like the Book of Enoch, the being of Azazel surfaces as a commander of descended celestial messengers who contaminates humanity. The Dead Sea Scrolls communicate regarding Belial, the celestial messenger of obscurity, who conducts conflict against the offspring of brightness. These developing conceptions mirrored increasing efforts to clarify the source of wickedness in a reality generated by a virtuous God. By the period of initial Christianity, these varied threads had merged into a more consolidated conception of Satan as God's primary opponent. Christian comprehension retroactively recognized Lucifer with the serpent in paradise, the opponent in Job, and the descended entity portrayed in Isaiah and Ezekiel. The New Testament depicts this being as the sovereign of malevolent entities, the one tempting Jesus, and in the end, the dragon of Revelation, bound for ultimate failure. It was the initial church leaders who solidified the association between Lucifer, Latin meaning bearer of brightness, initially referring to Venus as the morning celestial body, and Satan. Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation presented Isaiah 4:12 as, "How have you descended from paradise, O Lucifer, who ascended in the morning?" This translation selection permanently connected the identifier Lucifer with the descended celestial messenger conception, though the initial Hebrew designation was shining one, offspring of the dawn. In Islam, the being identified as Iblis or Shaitan possesses similarities with the Judeo-Christian Satan, yet with significant distinctions. Based on Quranic tradition, Iblis was not a celestial messenger, but a jinn generated from vapor without smoke, who resided among celestial messengers owing to his devotion. His plunge arrived when he declined God's instruction to prostrate before the freshly generated Adam, asserting superiority owing to his fiery character compared to Adam's earthen composition. This interpretation accentuates arrogance instead of hunger for strength as the fundamental wrongdoing, with Iblis acquiring authorization from Allah to entice humanity until the day of reckoning. Beyond these Abrahamic traditions, beings resembling dimensions of Lucifer surface across global mythologies, trickster deities, universal opponents, and descended divine entities. Norse mythology communicates regarding Loki, whose mischief in the end results in the final battle. Zoroastrianism presents Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, the annihilating essence in perpetual resistance to Ahura Mazda, the one who creates. Hinduism portrays varied asuras who resist the devas, occasionally through arrogance or aspiration. Medieval European comprehension of Lucifer integrated components from these varied traditions alongside popular beliefs, generating the recognizable horned, trident-carrying devil of widespread imagination. Dante's Inferno depicts Satan as a monstrous three-faced giant confined waist-level in frozen water at the core of the underworld, a distant departure from the luminous being portrayed in Ezekiel. This cultural development mirrors not solely theological progression, but humanity's persistent effort to give form to and comprehend wickedness. Artistic expression and written works additionally transformed Lucifer's representation. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan surfaces as an intricate, nearly sorrowful being whose celebrated statement, "superior to govern in the underworld than yield in paradise," captured a rebellious essence that would subsequently resonate with romantic literary figures. William Blake would depict him as a misinterpreted revolutionary, while Goethe's Mephistopheles personified skeptical mental capacity. These artistic comprehensions occasionally diverge substantially from theological correctness, yet disclose the persistent strength of the archetype. Throughout these cultural transformations, particular themes persist consistently. Arrogance preceding a plunge, attractiveness tainted, rebellion against sacred structure, and the alluring strength of misleading. Whether perceived as literal entity or mental metaphor, the being of Lucifer persists in functioning as a potent representation of how the most elevated creation can plunge the most distant when separated from its origin. As we rotate from cultural comprehensions to particular scriptural narratives, potentially in no location, is the developing conception of Satan more apparent than in the ancient book of Job, where we face not the tempter of Genesis or the dragon of Revelation, but something more subtle, an accuser functioning within the limitations of sacred authorization. The book of Job presents one of the most fascinating depictions of Lucifer in scriptural written works, a depiction that varies substantially from both preceding and subsequent representations. In this passage, we face not a serpent murmuring enticements nor a dragon conducting universal conflict, but a being recognized merely as the Satan who operates within the celestial tribunal with clear liberty and participates in immediate conversation with God. The initial scene unfolds with celestial entities, the offspring of God, presenting themselves in the Lord's presence. Among their number arrives the Satan. The Hebrew designation transports the specific article, the, signifying a designation or function instead of an actual identifier. This opponent surfaces as a functionary in sacred employment, a legal prosecutor or examiner whose operation is to examine and contest. When God indicates Job's remarkable righteousness, the Satan reacts not with transparent rebellion, but with doubtful inquiry. Does Job revere God for no reason whatsoever? This interaction discloses a Lucifer who functions with sacred authorization within established parameters. When he contests Job's moral character, he must initially acquire permission from God, who establishes particular restrictions. Everything he possesses is within your strength, yet on the individual personally, do not place a finger. Subsequently, these parameters are broadened, yet still solidly established. He is within your grasp, yet you must preserve his existence. This is not a Satan functioning autonomously, but one functioning within a sacredly established structure. The Satan's reasoning in Job discloses a skeptical perspective of human moral excellence. He indicates that Job's righteousness is merely transactional, the result of material success instead of authentic commitment. Extend your influence and eliminate everything he possesses, and he will without doubt curse you directly to your presence. This viewpoint provides comprehension into Lucifer's personal plunge. Having dismissed selfless affection and duty personally, he transfers this identical incapacity onto humanity. He cannot comprehend righteousness that isn't self-benefiting because his personal rebellion originated from self-concern. What causes the Job narrative to be particularly remarkable is its depiction of a frigidly analytical opponent instead of an impassioned rebel. This Satan doesn't express fury against sacred power or generate extravagant assertions of autonomy. Instead, he operates nearly administratively, systematically examining human devotion through anguish. There is strategic planning instead of disorder in his method, a tactical dismantling of Job's favors, constructed to disclose what he maintains is unavoidable human unfaithfulness. The book of Job never specifically associates this being with the serpent of paradise, or recognizes him as a descended celestial messenger. Yet theological tradition sensibly connects them, perceiving in Job's Satan the identical entity who initially contested sacred virtue in the garden. The approaches persist consistently, implying uncertainty regarding God's moral fiber and the worth of devoted service to him. In paradise, he indicated God retained understanding in a selfish manner. In Job, he suggests God acquires commitment through favor. Both accusations contest sacred moral character. Following instigating Job's examinations, the Satan vanishes from the narrative. The remaining portion of the book concentrates on Job's anguish, his companion's imperfect theological understanding, and in the end, God's self-disclosure. This narrative selection accentuates a significant reality. While the opponent may start anguish, he does not regulate its significance or result. God persists as sovereign, laboring even through terrible situations to intensify Job's comprehension and connection with him. The opponent's failure in Job arrives not through spectacular confrontation, but through basic persistence. Despite forfeiting material wealth, offspring, physical wellness, and social standing, Job proclaims, "Though he eliminates me, still will I maintain hope in him." Job never discovers regarding the celestial conversation that initiated his anguish. His devotion emerges not from special awareness, but from arduously achieved confidence. Precisely the selfless commitment the Satan asserted was unattainable. What surfaces from Job's account is an opponent who essentially fails to comprehend both God and humanity. The Satan's skepticism prevents him from perceiving the capability of authentic connection between one who creates and the created. He functions from a transactional worldview that cannot grasp covenant affection. His contest transforms into the background against which Job's devotion, and through it God's merit, radiates more transparently. This depiction of Lucifer as prosecutor instead of transparent rebel would persist as influential in Jewish contemplation. Subsequent rabbinical tradition would progress the conception of the Yetzer Hara, the wicked tendency that persistently examines human moral excellence. Yet as scriptural disclosure advanced, this comparatively controlled depiction would broaden to encompass more immediate confrontation with sacred intentions, especially in the crucial wilderness face-to-face meeting with Jesus personally. When Jesus surfaced from the waters of ritual immersion, confirmed by the Father's voice and the essence's dissent, he was promptly guided by the essence into the barren wilderness to face enticement by the devil. This confrontation between the incarnated offspring of God and his timeless opponent designates a decisive intensification in the universal confrontation. No longer functioning through intermediaries or laboring from concealed positions, Lucifer immediately participates with the assured Messiah in a contest that would establish the foundation for Jesus' complete ministry. Following 40 periods of abstaining from sustenance, when Jesus was in a physically susceptible state, the tempter came near. The selection of moment discloses Lucifer's opportunistic tactical approach, assaulting at instants of bodily vulnerability, social separation, and transitional ambiguity. Yet the substance of the enticements discloses something more profound, a significant failure to comprehend Jesus' purpose and character. Each enticement invited Jesus to accomplish his messianic function in manners that would undermine its fundamental core. If you are the offspring of God, instruct these stones to transform into bread. This initial contest targeted not simply bodily appetite, but Jesus' comprehension of sacred offspring status. Would he utilize his strength for self-benefit, or persist reliant on the Father's provision? Jesus' reaction: humanity shall not exist on bread by itself, yet on every utterance that arrives from the mouth of God, confirmed anew the supremacy of spiritual nourishment over bodily contentment. The identical entity who had enticed Eve with prohibited fruit at this moment discovered his tactical approach, inverted by one who experienced appetite more intensely for righteousness than for bread. The subsequent enticement transferred to the temple peak in Jerusalem. If you are the offspring of God, throw yourself in a downward direction, the devil indicated, referencing Psalm 91's assurance of celestial messenger protection. In this instance, Lucifer tried to utilize sacred texts themselves as an instrument, illustrating his readiness to pervert sacred utterances for annihilating intentions. The enticement invited Jesus to require a remarkable indication that would force acknowledgement instead of invite devotion. Jesus' reaction: "Do not place the Lord your God to examination," dismissed both the manipulation of sacred texts and the requirement for sacred confirmation on human conditions. In conclusion, from an elevated mountain, the devil displayed to Jesus all the domains of the reality and their magnificence, presenting them in return for veneration. This most daring enticement disclosed Lucifer's supreme objective, not simply to generate wrongdoing, but to claim the veneration appropriately belonging to God exclusively. The declaration also laid bare his distorted sense of himself as the rightful sovereign over earthly realms. Jesus responded with force and clarity, "Get away from me, Satan, for the scriptures say, you must worship the Lord your God and serve only him." This proclamation made his absolute devotion to the Father crystal clear, while rejecting any route to establishing his kingdom that involved making deals with evil forces. During this entire desert encounter, Jesus countered every one of the tempter's proposals with Scripture, showing that God's word functions not simply as data, but as spiritual protection. Every temptation was answered not with brute force, but with humble submission to divine truth, a method that remains accessible to every believer who faces comparable spiritual struggles, even if those battles are less dramatic. After this face-to-face confrontation, Lucifer's resistance to Jesus' work persisted through both human intermediaries and demonic entities. When Jesus drove out demons, certain people accused him of wielding the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons, a claim Jesus revealed as completely illogical. If Satan casts out Satan, then he stands divided against himself. How then could his kingdom possibly survive? This interaction exposed both the organized nature of Satan's resistance to God's kingdom and the inherent instability of that resistance. All throughout the Gospels, Jesus consistently described Satan as the ruler of a kingdom destined for collapse, actively working against God's plans. He cautioned Peter, saying, "Satan has requested permission to sift each one of you like wheat." He revealed that the devil had planted the idea of betrayal in the heart of Judas, and he announced, "The moment has come for this world to be judged. The prince of this world is about to be cast out." The cross itself, which appeared to be Lucifer's crowning achievement in destroying the Messiah, instead became the instrument of his definitive downfall. This reversal, where seeming defeat transforms into genuine victory, defines the New Testament's perspective on spiritual combat. Paul later explained that through the cross, Christ stripped the powers and authorities of their weapons, publicly humiliating them and celebrating his triumph over them by means of the cross. The resurrection proved that death itself, Lucifer's most powerful tool against humanity, had been robbed of its power. Still, the New Testament makes it equally clear that although decisively conquered, the adversary continues his activities until the final completion of all things. Peter cautions believers to stay watchful and clear-headed. Your adversary, the devil, moves about like a hungry lion, searching for victims to consume. Paul recommends putting on God's complete armor to resist the devil's tactics and recognizes the continuing struggle not against human opponents but against rulers, authorities, and powers of this world of darkness. This dynamic between already accomplished and not yet fulfilled characterizes the present stage of spiritual warfare. The final outcome is guaranteed. Revelation depicts Satan's ultimate defeat and imprisonment in the lake of burning sulfur, yet the struggle persists. Believers engage in this cosmic conflict not through physical combat, but through trust, prayer, speaking truth, and living righteously. Every act of obedience to God becomes an act of defiance against the one who first brought rebellion into existence. The wilderness temptation set the template for this continuing struggle. Truth, pushing back against falsehood, worship rejecting false gods, service triumphing over self-centeredness. In each successive generation, the fight for human souls proceeds along these identical lines, with Lucifer modifying his timeless tactics to fit modern settings, while the fundamental character of the conflict stays the same. As we've followed the fallen angel's journey through biblical narrative, one trait has proven constant. Lucifer works through lies and deception. The New Testament emphasizes this fundamental tactic with remarkable precision. In John's Gospel, Jesus calls Satan the father of falsehood, stating that when he tells lies, he's speaking his own language, because he is both a liar and the originator of lies. This characterization shows that deception isn't merely a tool Lucifer uses. It represents the very core of his corrupted being. Perhaps the most revealing description of Lucifer's approach comes from the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he cautions that Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. This deep insight uncovers the adversary's most threatening characteristic. He doesn't always manifest as a hideous demon or clear-cut villain. Rather, he frequently presents himself clothed in the appearance of virtue, wisdom, and illumination. His most effective deceptions don't resemble deceptions whatsoever. The serpent in the garden didn't arrive with transparent hostility, but with what seemed like a sensible inquiry and the offer of greater understanding. This disguise pattern shows up repeatedly throughout Scripture. In the wilderness testing of Jesus, Satan doesn't reveal himself as overtly wicked. Instead, he quotes Scripture, offers answers to hunger, proposes a dramatic display of faith, and promises political authority for noble purposes. Each temptation carries within it a seed of something seemingly advantageous, wrapped in religious terminology. This refined strategy demonstrates why Lucifer is regarded as so perilous, not because he compels evil upon people, but because he causes evil to look good, helpful, and progressive. The book of Revelation describes Satan as deceiving the entire world, pointing to an extensive network of lies that reaches far beyond individual moments of temptation. Multiple New Testament passages urge believers to remain alert against these deceptions, with Peter likening the devil to a roaring lion seeking prey to devour. Yet this comparison contrasts sharply with the subtle reality of most temptations. They seldom announce their arrival with any roar. Theologians across Christian history have observed that Lucifer's most successful tactic isn't causing people to perform blatantly horrific deeds, but rather to slowly warp their understanding of reality itself. Through minor compromises, partial truths, and the obscuring of moral lines, he generates a confusion where the differences between good and evil grow progressively harder to identify. Lewis brilliantly illustrated this approach in The Screwtape Letters, depicting experienced demons coaching novice tempters to avoid aiming for sensational sins, and instead pursue the quiet dismantling of virtue through pride, minor grievances, and the progressive numbing of spiritual sensitivity. Another vital dimension of Lucifer's deception centers on accusation. The very title Satan comes from the Hebrew term meaning accuser or opponent. The book of Revelation identifies him as the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who brings charges against them before our God continuously, day and night. This points to a mental aspect of spiritual conflict. The inner voices of guilt, inadequacy, and judgment that numerous religious traditions link to demonic activity. While tempting people into wrongdoing, the adversary at the same time condemns them for succumbing, establishing a pattern of shame and despair. Throughout religious history, spiritual teachers have cautioned against two equally dangerous mistakes concerning the devil: either refusing to believe in his existence or developing an excessive fixation on his influence. Both approaches, they argue, advance his goals. By denying his reality, people might overlook his subtle effects. By overemphasizing his strength, they might assign him a position nearly equal to God's, forming an almost dualistic perspective that Scripture doesn't endorse. In contemporary times, those who study cults and extremist movements have noticed how many manipulative methods attributed to Lucifer. Separating people from community, controlling information, establishing us against them thinking, and the slow acceptance of previously unimaginable concepts reflect the techniques employed by human manipulators. Whether understood as actual spiritual warfare or as psychological wisdom about manipulation, the biblical description of Lucifer's deceptive methods provides a structure for comprehending how apparently good individuals can be guided down destructive roads while considering themselves enlightened or vindicated. The ultimate deception, according to Christian theology, is the falsehood that originated in Eden, that humans can achieve godlike status, deciding for themselves what's good and evil without facing consequences. This original lie, theologians propose, keeps reverberating through human history in every uprising against divine or moral authority, defended by promises of liberation, but ultimately resulting in enslavement. The story of Lucifer, which started in heaven's immaculate courts, reaches its ending in Revelation's apocalyptic visions. The final book of the Christian Bible depicts a climactic battle between good and evil that has seized humanity's imagination for 2,000 years. Here, the shadowy opponent who has worked behind the curtain throughout biblical history steps forward for a final catastrophic confrontation with the divine order. Revelation presents this conclusion through vivid symbolic imagery. The text explicitly connects Lucifer with the great dragon. The enormous dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent known as the devil or Satan, who misleads the entire world. This linkage connects Eden's serpent with the cosmic opponent facing ultimate judgment, forming a story arc extending from creation through to final completion. The dragon imagery recalls ancient Near Eastern mythology, where dragons symbolized chaos and resistance to divine order. Yet the biblical writer reimagines these symbols within a monotheistic structure. As the apocalyptic narrative progresses, Lucifer no longer operates through subtle manipulation alone, but surfaces as the force driving two frightening figures referred to as the beasts. The first rises from the ocean, bearing 7 heads and 10 horns, exercising political dominance and demanding worship. The second emerges from land, displaying miraculous abilities and imposing economic domination through the notorious mark of the beast. Biblical interpreters have extensively debated whether these figures represent particular historical individuals or serve as models for how satanic power operates through corrupted political, religious, and economic structures. Essential to Revelation's depiction is the assembling of armies for a final confrontation known as Armageddon. The text explains how demonic spirits, performing miraculous signs, travel out to the rulers of the entire world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God Almighty. This vision of a final cosmic war has deeply shaped Western concepts of good versus evil, inspiring innumerable artistic and literary creations, portraying the ultimate clash between light and darkness. The apocalyptic account includes a peculiar element about Lucifer being imprisoned for 1,000 years before being freed for one last revolt. This has produced various theological viewpoints, including premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism, each presenting different perspectives on how these prophecies connect to historical time and Christ's second coming. Whatever the interpretive framework, the text shows Lucifer as ultimately vanquished, not through an evenly matched contest between comparable powers, but via divine judgment that exposes his authority as fundamentally borrowed and restricted. Throughout Revelation, Lucifer emerges as the master counterfeiter, manufacturing dark imitations of divine realities. The unholy trinity consisting of the dragon and 2 beasts mirrors Father, Son, and Spirit. The beast's mark imitates the seal of God marked on believers' foreheads. The great prostitute of Babylon functions as a distorted reflection of Christ's bride. This pattern strengthens the theological idea that evil lacks originality and instead feeds parasitically on good, possessing no genuine creative capacity of its own. The apocalyptic portrayal of Lucifer weaves together elements from across biblical literature. The ancient serpent reappears, the accuser becomes accused. The deception that started with individuals reaches its peak in worldwide delusion. Most importantly, Revelation portrays Lucifer's defeat primarily not through overwhelming force, but through seemingly contradictory means. They conquered him through the blood of the Lamb and through the message of their testimony. This indicates that the final response to diabolic power rests in sacrifice and faithful witness rather than supremacy. For believers throughout the ages facing persecution, Revelation's picture of Lucifer's overthrow has offered hope that evil, regardless of how established or mighty it seems, is fundamentally temporary. The apocalyptic literature guarantees that the chaos dragon, though terrifying, will not speak the last word. The biblical narrative that opened with harmony in creation moves toward a renewed creation, where the adversary's influence ends permanently. While frequently understood as predictions concerning the future, many biblical experts view Revelation's primary function as resistance literature, composed to fortify Christians confronting Roman imperial persecution. In this interpretation, the apocalyptic symbols addressed first-century believers directly, with the beasts representing corrupt political powers, demanding divine tribute and economic compliance. The prophecy therefore operates simultaneously as future prediction and present encouragement, promising the faithful that apparent triumphs for evil will prove temporary. Whether approached as literal prophecy, symbolic theology, or some combination, Revelation's portrayal of Lucifer's final offensive crystallizes the Bible's core message about evil. It is authentic, powerful, and damaging, but neither original nor everlasting. The dragon that once occupied heaven's court as the morning star confronts an ending fitting for his rebellion. Not annihilation, which would echo his destructive tendency, but restraint and judgment that confirms cosmic justice. The final location prepared for Lucifer appears in Revelation's harsh imagery as the lake of fire and sulfur, a realm of ultimate penalty where, the text states, they will experience torment continuously, day and night, for all eternity. This fearsome conclusion to the adversary's cosmic uprising presents some of Scripture's most grave content, while raising deep theological questions about justice, punishment, and evil's fundamental nature. The lake of fire constitutes the definitive response to evil in biblical eschatology. Revelation chapter 20 describes a sequence where the devil, who had deceived them, was hurled into the lake of blazing sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had already been cast. This imagery builds upon previous biblical metaphors of fire, representing divine judgment, including the consuming fire mentioned in Deuteronomy, the eternal fire described in Jesus' parables, and the fiery destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The combined impact of these references points to not merely physical suffering, but a condition of total separation from divine presence and goodness. Notably, the text describes the lake of fire as originally prepared exclusively for the devil and his angels, implying this destination was never meant for human beings. This introduces the deep mystery of predestination, that beings originally fashioned for glory would select a route leading to such a conclusion. Medieval theologians such as Thomas Aquinas understood this as the ultimate demonstration of divine justice, where beings that categorically reject goodness receive existence completely devoid of it. Others, like C.S. Lewis, have characterized hell not as divine revenge, but as the logical endpoint of consistent choices made by a being, doors that remain locked from the inside. The lake of fire serves beyond mere punishment. It signifies containment. Throughout Revelation's imagery, evil isn't erased but confined, isolated from the new creation. This pattern emerges elsewhere in apocalyptic literature, where cosmic order gets restored not by eliminating chaotic elements, but by setting proper limits. Just as creation started with separation, light from darkness, upper waters from lower waters, the new creation is secured through the decisive isolation of evil from good. This final confinement of Lucifer addresses the core theological dilemma posed by his rebellion. How can perfect goodness and stubborn evil exist together? The lake of fire represents the ultimate quarantine of wickedness, blocking its expansion into renewed creation. Paradise restored demands, paradise protected, and Satan's binding provides exactly this guarantee. Christian tradition has produced various understandings of this eternal punishment. Some stress its retributive justice, fitting consequences for cosmic treason against divine goodness. Others emphasize its protective purpose, safeguarding the new creation from corruption. Still, others perceive symbolic dimensions, with fire representing purifying judgment that eliminates everything opposing divine love. Significantly, Revelation depicts not only Lucifer, but death and Hades themselves being thrown into the lake of fire, suggesting the thorough termination of everything that diminishes life. This imagery communicates more than punishment for evil beings. It illustrates the final removal of evil's consequences. In the new creation that follows, there will be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. For all these results of Lucifer's rebellion have been contained and conquered. The concept of eternal punishment has troubled numerous theologians and believers. Some traditions have formulated alternative interpretations, such as annihilationism, where beings in the lake of fire ultimately cease existing, or universalism, where the fire represents agonizing yet eventually purifying judgment leading toward restoration. Most Christian traditions, though, have preserved the eternal character of this judgment, recognizing in it the necessary counterpart to the eternal significance of free moral decision-making. Perhaps most striking is the contrast between Lucifer's fate and Christ's victory. While the adversary confronts eternal fire, believers receive the promise of the water of life. While Satan endures ultimate banishment, humanity is offered close communion with God. These opposing destinies underscore the fundamental choice presented throughout biblical narrative. Between pride and humility, rebellion and submission, self-glorification and self-giving love. For believers across history, the lake of fire has operated both as caution and comfort. Caution regarding the road of pride and rebellion that brought even an angel of light into darkness. Comfort that evil will not prevail eternally. The identical judgment that marks the adversary's downfall promises creation's renewal. The fire that destroys also cleanses, enabling the new heaven and new earth where everything is set right. This vision of ultimate cosmic justice challenges modern sensibilities that often favor restoration over retribution. Yet within its theological structure, the lake of fire represents not divine spite, but the unavoidable outcome of honoring the moral freedom of thinking beings. Having granted authentic agency to both angels and humans, God permits them to select their final destination, alignment with divine goodness or complete separation from it. The narrative of Lucifer presents one of theology's most intricate interpretive puzzles across different Christian traditions, Jewish commentaries, and Islamic viewpoints. Approaches to comprehending the fallen angel span from strictly literal to predominantly metaphorical, with innumerable positions occupying the space between these extremes. These differing interpretations disclose not simply variations in reading scripture, but fundamentally distinct understandings of cosmic structure, evil's sources, and human accountability. The literal interpretation, historically prevailing in Western Christianity, embraces the straightforward reading of biblical passages as recounting actual spiritual beings and occurrences. According to this view, Lucifer was a created angelic being who rebelled against God, was expelled from heaven alongside his followers, and persists in opposing divine purposes as Satan. Advocates of this interpretation highlight the consistent biblical presentation of the devil as a separate personality, possessing agency, intelligence, and intention. They observe that Jesus himself spoke of Satan as a genuine adversary, saw his fall like lightning from heaven, and confronted him directly during the wilderness testing. The metaphorical approach, gaining traction in modern theology, comprehends Lucifer chiefly as a personification of evil principles, human psychology, or social dynamics. This perspective often connects to demythologizing approaches to scripture that reinterpret supernatural components as expressions of deeper spiritual or psychological realities. Supporters contend that personifying evil assists humans in grasping abstract forces of destruction, selfishness, and corruption. They note that the coherent story of Lucifer's fall emerges from connecting dispersed biblical passages that originally addressed separate contexts, suggesting the narrative developed through theological reflection rather than historical documentation. Between these stances exist many refined approaches. Certain theologians uphold Lucifer's ontological reality while highlighting his symbolic importance, perceiving no conflict between literal and metaphorical interpretations. Others apply literary analysis to the relevant texts, observing how apocalyptic literature uses symbolic language that shouldn't be forced into literal structures. Still others concentrate on the functional role the Satan figure performs in Scripture, testing humans, accusing the unrighteous, and carrying out divine judgment without speculating extensively about his beginnings. Jewish interpretations of the Satan figure, from which Christian concepts of Lucifer partially derive, generally emphasize his function as the adversary or accuser, operating within divine sovereignty rather than opposing it. In traditional Jewish thinking, Satan serves as a prosecuting attorney in God's court rather than an independent foe. This perspective surfaces in the book of Job, where Satan questions Job's righteousness but operates strictly within divinely established boundaries. Modern Jewish commentaries frequently interpret Satan as representing the human inclination toward evil, the Yetzer Hara, rather than an external tempter. Islamic theology presents Iblis, the counterpart to Satan, as a jinn rather than a fallen angel who refused to bow before Adam out of arrogance and was therefore expelled from paradise. The Quranic narrative emphasizes Iblis's envy of humans and his appeal for delay until Judgment Day to demonstrate humanity's unworthiness. This account shares structural parallels with Christian understandings while diverging in significant theological particulars. Modern psychological interpretations of the Lucifer narrative have discovered remarkable alignment with analytical psychology. Carl Jung regarded Lucifer as embodying the shadow archetype, the rejected aspects of human consciousness that, when unacknowledged, acquire power and become destructive. In this interpretation, Lucifer's fall represents psychological truth about the hazards of repression and the necessity of integrating rather than denying shadow elements within human personality. Liberation theologians have reinterpreted the concept of Satan to signify systemic evil rather than personal temptation. In this structure, the principalities and powers mentioned in the New Testament represent oppressive social systems, economic exploitation, and political tyranny that enslave human communities. This approach redirects attention from individual moral failure to collective accountability for systemic injustice. Philosophical approaches to the problem of evil frequently engage with the Lucifer narrative as addressing the essential paradox of how evil appears in a world fashioned by a good God. The free will defense, articulated by philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, employs the story of angelic rebellion to demonstrate how a perfectly good creator could fashion beings capable of choices without those evil choices being the creator's responsibility. This interpretation emphasizes the value of freedom as explaining why God would create beings with genuine moral agency despite foreknowing their potential rebellion. Contemporary feminist theology has critically examined the gendered aspects of traditional Lucifer narratives, noting how concepts of cosmic rebellion have occasionally been employed to reinforce social hierarchies or discourage questioning of authority. These approaches ask whether traditional interpretations have sometimes functioned to stigmatize legitimate challenges to unjust power arrangements by labeling them as satanic rebellion. Across this theological range, the Lucifer narrative persists as a potent structure for understanding the mystery of evil's presence in a world believed to be created good. Whether interpreted literally, metaphorically, psychologically, or politically, the story furnishes language and concepts for wrestling with darkness, both outside and within human experience. Perhaps its lasting power resides precisely in this interpretive adaptability. Its ability to illuminate multiple dimensions of evil's reality while gesturing toward the ultimate victory of light. The narrative of Lucifer, the brilliant morning star who plummeted from heaven, has left a permanent impression on human culture, extending far beyond theological conversation. From literature to visual arts, music to popular entertainment, this archetypal story of cosmic rebellion keeps resonating across centuries and civilizations, even as interpretations continue evolving. The fallen angel has emerged as one of the most recognizable and multifaceted figures in Western cultural imagination, embodying conflicts between authority and freedom, obedience and individuality that remain unresolved in human experience. In literature, Lucifer's depiction has experienced remarkable transformations. Milton's Paradise Lost revolutionized the character by presenting a complex, almost sympathetic Satan whose celebrated declaration, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," captured the essence of defiance against perceived tyranny. This portrayal influenced the Romantic poets, especially Blake and Byron, who sometimes depicted Lucifer as a heroic rebel against arbitrary authority rather than a malevolent tempter. Later works like Goethe's Faust and Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita presented Satan figures of profound ambiguity, simultaneously destructive and revealing, challenging overly simplistic moral categories. Visual representations of Lucifer trace a captivating evolution. Early Christian art portrayed him as bestial and monstrous, emphasizing his separation from divine beauty. Renaissance artists frequently depicted him as grotesque, yet retaining traces of his former glory. William Blake's illustrations presented a more nuanced figure, physically beautiful, yet tormented. Gustave Doré's famous engravings for Paradise Lost cemented the image of a fallen angel with magnificent bat-like wings, physically imposing yet marked by anguish. Modern artistic interpretations continue this complexity, often employing Lucifer's image to explore themes of alienation, rebellion, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Music has repeatedly explored the Lucifer narrative, from medieval plainchant denouncing the devil to romantic compositions like Franz Liszt's Mephisto Waltz. The character has maintained particular relevance in blues, rock, and heavy metal, where his rebellion sometimes symbolizes resistance against perceived social or religious oppression. The Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, which presents history from Lucifer's viewpoint, exemplifies how popular culture has utilized the character to challenge conventional moral structures and explore the complexities of evil. Cinema and television have extended this cultural reinterpretation. Films from Bedazzled to The Devil's Advocate explore Faustian themes of temptation and damnation. The series Lucifer reimagines the fallen angel as a charismatic nightclub owner assisting with crime solving in Los Angeles while wrestling with questions of free will and redemption. A considerable departure from traditional theological portrayals, yet still engaging with the fundamental themes of the original narrative. Beyond specific artistic creations, Luciferian imagery saturates cultural discourse about power, rebellion, and moral complexity. Political revolutionaries have occasionally identified with the fallen angel's defiance against established authority. Conversely, political rhetoric frequently employs satanic imagery to condemn opposing ideologies as not merely incorrect, but evil. The very concept of demonization reveals how profoundly Satan imagery is woven into our conceptual frameworks for understanding opposition and otherness. Psychological interpretations have discovered in Lucifer a powerful metaphor for human struggles with ego, pride, and self-destruction. The pattern of brilliance corrupted by its own light, of gifts turned against their intended purpose, resonates with human experience across cultural and religious boundaries. The biblical warning that pride goes before destruction finds its ultimate expression in the archangel, whose excellence became the source of his downfall. A cautionary tale that transcends specific theological frameworks. The cultural legacy of Lucifer also encompasses complex questions about authority and freedom that remain unresolved in modern consciousness. The angelic rebellion raises profound issues. When does legitimate authority become tyranny? When does freedom become destructive license? When does justified resistance become self-serving rebellion? These questions, central to the original narrative, continue to animate political philosophy, ethics, and social movements today. For believers, the Lucifer narrative provides a foundational understanding of evil's reality without granting it ultimate or original status. It acknowledges darkness as a genuine force, while affirming light as more fundamental. This theological framework allows evil to be taken seriously without elevating it to equality with goodness, avoiding both naive optimism that underestimates evil's power and dualistic pessimism that views good and evil as equal cosmic principles. Perhaps most significantly, the Lucifer story illuminates the paradox of freedom itself. Created with perfect liberty and an unfallen will, the brightest angel chose rebellion, suggesting that freedom always involves genuine risk. This insight resonates beyond religious boundaries, touching universal human experiences of choice and consequence. The narrative suggests that meaningful freedom necessarily includes the possibility of choosing wrongly, a profound, even disturbing truth that challenges simplistic understandings of both divine and human relationships. As humanity continues wrestling with questions of good and evil, rebellion and obedience, pride and humility, the ancient story of the fallen morning star remains a potent framework for understanding the human condition. Its enduring power lies not in literal interpretations alone, but in capturing fundamental tensions of existence, how light becomes darkness, how beauty becomes corruption, how the freedom to love includes the freedom to reject. Within these tensions, the Lucifer narrative continues, illuminating the shadows and light of human experience across cultures and centuries. In the emptiness between heaven and earth, a solitary figure falls, radiant even in dissent, beautiful even in rebellion. The morning star, once heaven's most brilliant light, now traces a burning path across eternity. This image, with which we opened our exploration, returns now with deeper meaning. For we have observed the complete arc of Lucifer's tragic journey, from the peaks of celestial glory to the depths of cosmic exile. The story of Lucifer unveils a profound paradox at existence's center. The very attributes that made him magnificent, his brilliance, his beauty, his power, his freedom, became through pride the tools of his destruction. Excellence warped into arrogance, service corrupted into domination, light transformed into darkness. The bearer of illumination became the prince of shadows. This ancient narrative continues capturing our imagination because it speaks to tensions we recognize within ourselves. The impulse towards self-glorification that whispers, "You will be like God." The temptation to place our desires above all other concerns. The subtle descent from rightful ambition to destructive pride. When we hear Lucifer declare, "I will ascend," something within human consciousness recognizes both the glory and the peril of such assertion. Throughout our exploration, we have observed how a perfect being could choose imperfection, how freedom could lead to bondage, how rebellion against the source of existence could only conclude in diminishment rather than enhancement of being. The fallen angel's trajectory invites us to consider our own choices. Whether we will serve light or shadow, whether we will embrace the truth of our created status, or grasp for a counterfeit divinity that ultimately destroys. The biblical narrative presents Lucifer's fall not as an unavoidable tragedy, but as a choice bearing cosmic consequences. It suggests that even beings of immense power and intelligence remain accountable for their decisions. That freedom, true freedom, always entails responsibility. Neither angel nor human can escape the fundamental structure of reality, where actions generate consequences, where paths chosen lead to destinations inherent in their direction. As we conclude this journey through the story of heaven's fallen morning star, we are left not with simple answers, but with profound questions that have animated human, spiritual, and philosophical inquiry across millennia. What is the nature of evil? How does corruption enter a good creation? What are the proper boundaries of created freedom? What constitutes the right relationship between creator and created? The Lucifer narrative does not resolve these mysteries, but it frames them within a compelling story that continues resonating across religious and cultural boundaries. Perhaps the final message of Lucifer's fall is simultaneously a warning and a hope, a warning about the self-destructive nature of pride, and a hope that even the deepest darkness cannot ultimately overcome light. For while the biblical story depicts a genuine cosmic struggle, it does not present good and evil as equal forces locked in eternal combat. Rather, it portrays evil as derivative, parasitic, and ultimately temporary, a distortion of original goodness that will finally be contained and overcome. The morning star falls, but a new creation dawns. The light-bearer rebels, but light itself remains undiminished. The ancient enemy schemes, but love proves more powerful than hatred. This cosmic drama, first glimpsed in scattered biblical passages and elaborated through centuries of theological reflection, continues illuminating our understanding of both the heights to which creation can soar and the depths to which it can descend when freedom turns against its source. In the luminous figure who became the Prince of Darkness, we glimpse both warning and reflection, a warning about the peril of pride and a reflection of our own capacity for both magnificence and corruption. The story of Lucifer thus becomes not merely ancient mythology, but a living parable about the consequences of pride, the nature of true freedom, and the eternal tension between rebellious self-assertion and loving obedience that defines the moral universe.